I have a sister, and to say she's a mess is putting it mildly. I love her, I really do, but she's always been the kind of person who just can't seem to get her life together. It's like she's stuck in this perpetual cycle of chaos, no job, no steady income, always jumping from one crisis to the next. She's the type who can make a mountain out of a molehill, and somehow, every little bump in the road becomes a full-blown disaster. It's exhausting just watching her go through life, always scrambling to stay afloat. A few months ago, she hit me up out of the blue, saying she needed a place to stay. It wasn't exactly a shock. She's stayed with friends before, couch surfed, and even had a few stints living back with our parents, but it never lasted long. Eventually, she'd wear out her welcome, and she'd be back to square one, trying to find somewhere new to land. So when she asked me, I knew what I was getting into. Still, I have a big enough house, and it's just me here, so I figured, why not? She's my sister. I can help her out. I laid down some pretty clear rules right from the start. I told her she could stay with me, but it wasn't going to be forever. I gave her a timeline, a few months to get her act together, find a job, and save up a little bit of money so she could eventually move out on her own. I wasn't going to be her long-term solution, just a temporary safety net. She agreed, or at least, she nodded and said all the right things. She swore up and down that she was serious this time, that she was going to use this chance to get back on her feet. And, to be fair, I wanted to believe her. To make sure she had a little bit of cash, I decided to pay her $100 a week to help out around the house. Nothing too intense, just basic chores like vacuuming, dusting, cleaning the bathrooms, and doing some laundry. I work long hours, and I'll admit, I'm not the best at keeping the place spotless, so I figured this could be a win-win. She'd have a little bit of spending money, and I'd have a cleaner house. Honestly, it felt like a pretty generous setup. I mean, she was getting a free place to stay and $100 a week on top of that, which I thought was more than fair. For the first few weeks, everything seemed to be going okay. I'd come home and the place would look tidy. The floors were vacuumed, the countertops were wiped down, and it even smelled fresh, like she'd been using those lavender-scented cleaning sprays I like. I thought, all right, maybe this is actually working. Maybe she's really turning over a new leaf. She was getting her $100 every week, and I didn't mind handing it over because, at the end of the day, it felt like a small price to pay for some peace of mind. But then, a couple of weeks ago, things got weird. I gave her the usual $100, just like every week before, but this time, she didn't just take it and say thank you. She kind of lingered, like she was waiting for something. I looked at her, and she just came right out and said it. You owe me more. I was confused, like, what was she talking about? As far as I knew, she was getting paid exactly what we'd agreed on. I didn't understand why she thought I owed her more money. So, I asked her, what are you talking about? Because, genuinely, I had no clue where this was coming from. She had this whole argument ready, like she'd been rehearsing it in her head. Apparently, she'd been doing extra work around the house, and she expected to be compensated for it. I was still trying to piece this all together, so I asked her, what extra work? Because I hadn't noticed anything beyond the regular cleaning. I mean, the house was clean, but it wasn't like she was out here building an extension or anything. I was trying really hard not to laugh at the ridiculousness of the situation, but she was dead serious. So I told her, look, I never asked you to walk my dog. You decided to do that on your own, and I'm not paying you for something I didn't ask for. But she wasn't done yet. She then said she'd been doing even more work for me, and I was ripping her off by not paying her for it. It turns out she'd put together a scrapbook of personal letters, cards, and other papers that had been in a drawer in my office. She said she saw it while she was cleaning and thought it would be nice to organize them. I hadn't even noticed, to be honest. I asked her why she did it, and she said she figured I'd like to have everything in one place. Okay, fine. But then she said, according to Etsy, people sell scrapbooks like that for $75, so she wanted to be paid for that as well. At this point, I'm just staring at her, trying to wrap my head around this. I told her, you never asked me if I wanted you to do any of that. I didn't hire you to be my dog walker or to make a scrapbook. You're getting paid to keep the house clean, and that's it. but she kept pushing back, saying all of this fell under the umbrella of keeping the house clean, and I was trying to scam her out of money she deserved. She was genuinely mad, and I was genuinely shocked. I couldn't believe this was even a conversation. I was sitting there thinking, is this really happening? But she was adamant. I don't know what made me do it, but in that moment, I just wanted to defuse the situation. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I was just exhausted from the back and forth, but I ended up caving. I said, fine, I'll pay you this time, but we need to be clear that this won't happen again. I thought. Maybe she was trying to tell me in her own way that she needed a little extra cash. Maybe things were tighter than I realized, and she didn't know how to ask me directly, so she took it upon herself to find ways to earn more. So, I handed her the $125 she wanted for walking the dog, plus another $75 for the scrapbook. I figured that was the end of it. I had been clear about my expectations, and she'd gotten her extra money. Maybe now things would settle down. I could move past the weirdness of this conversation and just hope she would start looking for a job like we'd initially agreed. In my head, I justified it by thinking that if a little extra money would help her out, it was worth it, even if the way she went about it was completely bizarre. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. The next day, I came home from work in the evening, just like always. I was tired and ready to wind down, but as soon as I opened the door, I could smell something incredible coming from the kitchen. It wasn't just the usual scent of dinner cooking, it was like she'd gone all out. I walked in, and there she was, bustling around the kitchen, with what looked like a full spread laid out on the table. There was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a huge salad, freshly baked bread, and even a dessert, a homemade pie cooling on the counter. For a second, I thought maybe she was trying to make up for our argument the day before, like this was her way of saying sorry for the awkwardness. I hadn't asked her to cook, but it looked delicious, and I figured, hey, why not enjoy it? She smiled at me when I walked in, all cheerful and proud, and told me to sit down because dinner was ready. So, I did. I was tired, hungry, and honestly, I wasn't going to turn down a nice meal. We sat there and ate, and I'll admit, the food was fantastic. It was probably the best meal I'd had in weeks. She chatted away while we ate, talking about her day, making small talk about some show she'd been watching, and it almost felt normal for a while. I was starting to think, okay, maybe this is her way of showing that she can contribute in other ways. I was still cautious, but for that moment, I just enjoyed the food and the company. But then, as we were finishing up, she casually mentioned, so, for all this, I think $200 should be fair. I nearly choked on my drink. I was like, what? I genuinely thought I'd misheard her at first. But no, she was dead serious. She started going on about how much effort she'd put into making the meal, how she'd spent the whole afternoon cooking, and how if I'd gone out to a restaurant, I would have paid way more for a meal like that. She even broke it down, talking about how each dish would cost $20 or $30 if ordered separately, and that dessert alone would have been a pricey add-on. I was floored. I told her, wait a minute, the food you used to make all this, I bought it. It was already in the fridge and pantry, and I didn't ask you to cook it. You can't just decide to charge me $200 for dinner when I never agreed to it. But she didn't back down. She just kept insisting that she'd worked hard and put a lot of effort into the meal, and that effort was worth something. I was amazed at how she could say all of this with a straight face, like she genuinely believed I owed her for something she'd decided to do on her own. She kept pushing, saying that cooking the meal was extra work, just like walking the dog or making the scrapbook, and she deserved to be compensated for her time. She even started comparing it to catering services, saying if I'd hired someone to make a meal like this, it would have cost me a lot more than $200. I just sat there, stunned, trying to figure out how we'd gone from having a nice dinner to her trying to charge me for it. At this point, I was starting to get really frustrated. I told her, look, I appreciate the meal, but this is ridiculous. You can't just do something without asking and then demand money for it after the fact. If you wanted to cook dinner and get paid for it, you should have talked to me about it beforehand. But she just wouldn't let it go. She kept saying that she'd put in the time, and she should be rewarded for that time, and I was being unfair by refusing to pay. The more she talked, the angrier she got, and the more I realized that this wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about her feeling like she was owed something. I don't know where this attitude came from, but it was clear she thought she was entitled to more than what she was getting, and she was willing to find any way to justify it. It didn't matter that I'd been clear about the agreement when she moved in, or that she was already getting more help than she'd probably gotten from anyone else. She was going to find a way to push for more, no matter how unreasonable it was. I felt like I was being cornered. It was the same as the day before with the dog walking and the scrapbook, but this time it was even worse because I'd let my guard down, thinking we were just sharing a nice meal. I wanted to keep my cool, but I could feel my patience wearing thin. I told her, as calmly as I could, "I'm not paying you $200 for dinner, especially not when you use my groceries to make it. This has to stop." But she didn't stop. She kept pushing, trying to guilt me into paying, and I could see that familiar stubbornness in her eyes, like she wasn't going to back down until she got what she wanted. I don't know why I was even surprised at this point. I'd seen this behavior before, but I guess part of me hoped things would be different this time. That maybe she'd respect the boundaries we'd set. But she didn't, and I realized I'd been fooling myself thinking she ever would. After I refused to pay for the dinner, the atmosphere shifted instantly. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and all the warmth and friendliness from earlier vanished. My sister's expression changed from hopeful anticipation to sheer disbelief. She just stared at me for a few seconds, like she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. I could see the shock in her eyes, the kind of look you'd expect if I'd just told her something completely outrageous, like the world was flat or gravity didn't exist. She just stood there, hands on her hips, and for a moment, I thought maybe she was going to let it go. Maybe she'd realize how ridiculous this whole thing was and drop it, but no, of course not. Instead, she launched into another rant, this time angrier than before. She was offended, genuinely offended, like I'd just committed some unforgivable crime. She started raising her voice, talking about how ungrateful I was, how I didn't appreciate anything she did, and how I was taking advantage of her kindness. It was baffling to me. I couldn't believe that we were actually having this argument. I mean, it was one thing for her to bring up dog walking or scrapbooking, but this? I had let her live here rent-free, I'd given her spending money, I'd even gone along with paying her for those other jobs just to keep the peace. But now, she was trying to charge me $200 for a meal I never asked her to make, using groceries I bought. It felt like she was deliberately pushing every possible boundary, just to see how far she could take it. She kept going on and on, saying she was just trying to do something nice and I was punishing her for it. That I didn't understand how hard she'd worked, and that if I didn't want to pay, then I clearly didn't care about her effort or appreciate anything she did. I could feel myself getting more and more frustrated, but I tried to stay calm. I knew that if I lost my temper, it would only make things worse, and I didn't want this to escalate into a full-blown fight. But it was hard, especially when she started throwing out accusations, saying things that made no sense, like how I was always selfish and never thought about anyone but myself. The whole thing was turning into a mess. I kept trying to explain to her, as patiently as I could, that I wasn't trying to disrespect her or dismiss her efforts, but that she couldn't just decide to do things and then expect to be paid for them. But it didn't matter what I said. She wasn't hearing any of it. She was too caught up in her own narrative, convinced that I was the bad guy in this situation, and nothing I said was going to change that. At some point, she just snapped. She said she was done, that if I didn't want to appreciate what she did, then she wasn't going to stay here anymore. She stormed off, muttering under her breath, and I just sat there, stunned. I didn't even know what to say. Part of me thought she was bluffing, that she'd cool down after a while and we'd be able to talk it out later. But then I heard her in her room, slamming drawers and shuffling around, and I realized she was serious. I didn't go after her. I just sat there, feeling this weird mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief. It was like everything had spiraled out of control so quickly, and I was left wondering how we'd even gotten to this point. I mean, a week ago, I was just trying to help her out, giving her a place to stay, and now she was packing up to leave because I refused to pay her for a meal I never asked for. It felt surreal, like I was in some bizarre alternate reality where everything was backwards. She didn't take long to pack. I could hear her moving around, throwing things into a bag, still muttering angrily to herself. Then she came out, dragging her stuff with her, and without even looking at me, she headed straight for the door. I wanted to say something, to try to find a way to salvage the situation, but I didn't know what. It was like anything I could have said would have just made things worse, so I stayed quiet. She left, slamming the door behind her, and suddenly the house was silent. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I thought things would be okay after I paid her for the dog walking and the scrapbook. I thought that would be the end of the weird demands and we could go back to some semblance of normalcy, but clearly, I was wrong. Then, a few hours later, I started getting messages from family. Apparently, she'd gone straight to them, telling them her version of what had happened, and now they were coming at me. One after another, the messages came in, and they all had the same tone: disappointment, judgment, telling me I was wrong. She was just trying to help, they said. She put in all that effort, and you couldn't even show a little appreciation. She's your sister. The least you could have done was pay her for trying. I couldn't believe it. It was like they'd all bought into this narrative that she was some kind of martyr who'd gone out of her way to make my life better, and I was the ungrateful villain who couldn't be bothered to acknowledge her effort. I tried to explain my side, but nobody wanted to hear it. They didn't care that I'd been supporting her, giving her a place to stay, paying her to clean. None of that mattered. All they saw was that she'd tried to do something nice, and I hadn't paid her for it. It was infuriating. I felt like I was banging my head against a wall, trying to make them understand that it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, about her overstepping and acting like she was entitled to whatever she decided to do. But they didn't see it that way. They just kept saying I should have paid her, that it wouldn't have been a big deal, and I was making a mountain out of a molehill. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about her demanding money anymore. It was about how easily she'd managed to turn everyone against me, how quickly they were willing to believe her side without even asking for mine. I couldn't understand how they didn't see what she was doing, how manipulative it was, but I guess it's easier to play the victim when you're not the one holding all the responsibility. I tried to brush it off, to not let it get to me, but it was hard. The messages kept coming, and it felt like I was being ganged up on, like I was the bad guy for not letting her walk all over me. I kept telling them that it was absurd, that no one just goes and cooks a meal with someone else's groceries and then expects to be paid $200 for it, but it was like talking to a wall. They were so caught up in the idea of family helping family that they couldn't see how backwards this whole thing was. So there I was, sitting in my own house, feeling like the villain in a story I didn't even want to be a part of. It was almost laughable, in a way. I'd let her move in because I wanted to help, because I thought maybe she'd get her life together if she had some stability. I thought I was doing a good thing, but now, it was like that had been turned against me, twisted into something ugly, and I was left feeling like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I don't know what she expected to happen when she left. Maybe she thought I'd cave and beg her to come back, or maybe she just wanted to make a scene. But I wasn't about to play into it. I wasn't going to be manipulated, not by her and not by the rest of the family. It was clear that if this was how things were going to be, I was better off without the drama. And if that made me the bad guy in their eyes, then so be it. Am I Rita for refusing to pay for the dinner my sister cooked with my groceries?